as you see on the screen with the agenda for today, our presentation, we just went through some of our introductions and opening remarks, laid out some of the ground rules for everyone. We're going to go through and introduce the project. We're going to talk about the NEPA process, environmental analysis, and then we'll kind of close with the presentation and conclusions. All right, why we're here? We're here because we all know that carp are invasive and they're an issue. We're here to present the pilot program. We want to solicit feedback and explain the NEPA process, provide some of our next steps, and communicate to the public our draft documents, the program management plan, and the draft programmatic environmental assessment. Invasive carp. There are 4 species of invasive carp: silver carp, bighead carp, grass carp, black carp, among others. But the 4 main species are qualified as invasive carp. They were imported into the U.S. in the 60s and 70s for aquatic plant control. And then during flooding events back in the 80s and 90s in the Delta region of the Mississippi River, they escaped, were released, and now they are abundant throughout the Mississippi River basin and its tributaries. The problem with invasive carp, so they outcompete native species for food sources, they eliminate aquatic habitat, and they have the ability to jump out of the water, which causes a problem to boaters and recreation. So with this problem of invasive carp, back in 2020, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, specifically the Nashville District, was tasked to develop a pilot program to install up to 10 projects on the Tennessee and Cumberland River. And then in 2022, the Tenn-Tom waterway was introduced. We were authorized up to 25 million. We were not appropriated. We were only authorized. So that means that we do not have money on hand to spend. We have to be appropriated funds first, and that comes with additional requirements that I'll explain later in the presentation. And then we have to have a non-federal sponsor, so therefore a minimum of 25% non-federal cost for total project cost is required. And then once after project completion, O&M will be 100% federal. On this slide, I provided a list of activities that have kind of been completed to date. So back in 2022, we conducted a scoping notice that was sent out to the public to provide feedback on the program. In 2022 as well, we began our interagency partnership meetings. In December of 23, we completed the draft planning documents that included the program management plan and the programmatic environmental assessment. In February of 24, we received a recommendation from MICRA, again, another agency that's in our partnership, that provided a list of the recommended locations. And again, I just want to point out that this is a recommendation, it's not a decision. And again, that was back in February 24. In July of 24, we completed internal reviews, we initiated the agency review, and we initiated this public review. Going into the MICRA recommendation that was provided, they recommended simultaneous construction of projects among all of the locations, if possible. The 25 million would not be able to cover that. So because we are not able to complete simultaneous and execute simultaneous installation, they provided a priority list that you see on the screen. Barkley is number 1, Kentucky's number 2, Jamie Whitten is number 3, Wilson Lock and Dam or Pigwick Lock and Dam is number 4, Cheatham is number 5, and then GP Sony on the Tenn-Tom waterway is number 6. So within the draft program management plan, this document defines how the program will be implemented and managed. It also defines the term pilot. The invasive carp pilot program, the word pilot is temporary in nature, so it is not permanent, and we are authorized to spend 25 million. That means that once the 25 million is exhausted, the pilot program is over, and at that point, everything that we have installed would technically have to be removed. This management plan also provides the requirements, which includes the non-federal sponsor requirement of minimum 25%, which I mentioned earlier. It also provides a requirement for the appropriation of funding. We have to receive that funding in order to execute the program. And we also have to provide a report that describes the effectiveness of the program. So we have to evaluate amongst the entire program and the basin how effective we are at managing and preventing the spread of invasive carp. And now Chip Hall, the Nashville District, will present the NEPA process.
Stephen, good evening, everyone. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the National Environmental Policy Act and, what it is, why we do it, and how it's related to the pilot program. So the National Environmental Policy Act was a law passed in the 70s that established the country's environmental policy and the process in which that we would go through evaluating impacts of federal actions. Next slide. So we have a small flow chart here that kind of explains some of the different ways that we evaluate federal actions through under the NEPA policy. We have a couple of different ways of doing that depending on what level of action we're looking at. For small actions that are very well defined in our agency specific policies, is called a categorical exclusion. The next step up, slightly bigger projects that we're going to evaluate the potential impacts to determine if any are significant, is called a environmental assessment. Once going through that process, and the next level up is an environmental impact statement, which means we've identified a likely potential impact that is significant. And therefore, we go through the process of evaluating basically exactly how that impact affects the human environment and allow the public to see those evaluations and decisions. The policy ensures that the public has informed access to the federal agency decisions, and to hopefully understand the way those decisions could impact our human environment. Next slide. So why does NEPA relate to this potential CARP pilot program? So the NEPA process begins when an agency has a proposal or a potential action that we're considering taking. It could be different things from construction to changes in the way that we manage our resources, to granting permits or granting funding to individuals or groups for one of their projects. And so in this case, the implementation of this pilot program could result in construction and operation of these temporary deterrent projects. Therefore, impacts could occur. Next slide. So where are we in the NEPA process? Stephen described some of the dates for some of these activities at the beginning of the presentation. So we start out with a potential action that the government is considering, that the agency is considering. And we involve the public initially in a public scoping process. For this project, it was back in 2022. We go through the alternative impact analysis. So we actually try to determine the potential impacts from not just the proposed action, but also any alternatives to that action. And then once we've completed a draft environmental assessment, we involve the public again on a review of those draft documents. And that's where we are currently in the pilot program. Once the public review period is over, we take comments and input from that process, and we develop the final environmental assessment and documents. Next slide. So I'd like to talk briefly about the difference between a programmatic environmental assessment and a conventional environmental assessment. They're very similar. Both are going to have potential environmental effects that are evaluated. Both are going to include the public involvement process, and both are going to also have the draft documents available to the public for review and comment. The difference is programmatic environmental assessments are looking at a program that doesn't necessarily have the specific actions identified. Therefore, the evaluation is from a very broad scope, from a very high level of potential effects, versus on a conventional EA, you have very fine detail that is potential from specific actions. So once we've completed this programmatic environmental assessment, we will potentially be moving into implementation of the program, where we'd be determining specific sites for deterrence and specific measures for deterrence. Once those are proposed and determined, we would have subsequent analyses that are tiered down from this programmatic environmental assessment that would also involve the public and be allowed for additional comment and consideration in the future. Next slide. So what is the purpose and need for our environmental assessment for the pilot program? So our purpose is to analyze the effectiveness of various technologies and methods and measures in specific locations designed to prevent the spread and to manage eradication of invasive carp in the Tennessee and Cumberland basins, as well as the Tenn-Tom waterway. So the purpose is actually to determine how effective potential technologies and methods are. Why do we need to do that? Well, we need to prevent or reduce the impacts caused by invasive carp. And this is one way that we can hopefully determine ways to do that. Next. So our scoping process back in 22, we received roughly 150 comments, and those comments are summarized in a table in the appendix of the environmental assessment. It's actually Appendix I. We also received 14 of those 150 comments were from various environmental organization tribes and other non-governmental organizations. The overall themes of those 150 comments, there was strong recognition that carp are a problem, also the need to prevent migration and reduce the impacts from those species. There was overall a majority support for the potential pilot program objectives, and there was notes of needing to do something quickly. Next slide. The alternatives considered. for the pilot program, for the programmatic EA, there are only two alternatives considered, and that's either to implement the pilot program or not. There are specific measures and methods that are discussed, and there are potential general impacts from those methods and measures that are noted. However, ultimately, the only alternative considered are either to implement the program or not. And as I had mentioned before, potential future NEPA analyses would include additional evaluation of measures such as the specific locations and the specific technologies that could be used in those locations, even down to potential design requirements for specific dam locations. Next slide. What was our conclusion? So the PGA concluded that effects from implementing the pilot program would be temporary in duration. As Stephen mentioned earlier, we have a specific authorization of $25 million. Once it's up, the program has to end. So therefore, any effects from the activities would be considered temporary. They are all considered either minor or moderate in scale. They are also not considered significant. So, and then final conclusion would be that pending the completion, the final EA and the final program management plan, USACE would continue efforts to identify a non-federal sponsor to begin implementation of the program. Next slide. How can you guys participate today? So just on the slide displayed currently, there is a Q code that will take you to the public notice on the district's website where you can access the draft documents. You can also find the emails and the mailing addresses to send comments in. Comments we would like to be substantive and relevant. What does that exactly mean? Well, we can appreciate individuals who, we may get a comment that states, yes, carp are destructive and we support the program. And that is helpful and that is noted and it will be included. A better example of substantive is maybe there's an opinion on the type of structure, the type of technologies we may use, or where we're locating them. Maybe there's concerns that we're starting on one section of the river instead of another. Those are examples of substantive comments. Please draft your own unique comment. We often get form letters, and form letters are also accepted and noted. The way we often handle form letters is maybe we'll get 25 letters. We make notes of how many of those form letters we received and summarize the form letter once. But with a unique comment, it gets summarized for every single unique comment we get. Please include your contact information. Just know that your personal information is not publicly released other than your name. So when you include your email address, your phone number, or your mailing address, those will not be released to the public. They'll be redacted before the final document is completed. Next slide. Very important note, the review period ends September 12th, 2024. So please get comments in before September 12th. As I said before, all substantive comments will be considered and included in the final environmental assessment. All verbal or informal questions will be taken, but not necessarily recorded. To the right on this slide, you can see the mailing address and the email address where you can submit comments.
Yes, thank you all again. Thank you for your time and interest. This will conclude the meeting.